Hello, dear grandchildren. It's Nana, and I have a story to read for you today. It is called How Mr. Monkey Saw the Whole World. How can you see the whole world? Let's find out. Okay, this is what the story looks like. Ta-da! So let's see if I can read with these glasses that make my eyes really big. A very long time ago, before you were born, there was a small island on which Mr. Monkey lived. Mr. Monkey liked living there, and he walked around with his nose in the air and a flower in his hair. Oh, a flower in his hair. Can I do that? Can I put a flower in my hair? Let's see. Oh, there we go. I got a flower in my hair. But then the hard time came, and everybody had to work very hard just to find something to eat. That is, everybody but Mr. Buzzard. Oh, if it was a hard time, then the flowers went away. Okay. One day, Mr. Monkey saw Mr. Buzzard talking to Mr. Hare. "Give me one yam for my belly," Mr. Buzzard said, "and I will fly you up to the clouds. You will be the first hare to see the whole world." Mr. Hare knew that the yams he had were to feed himself and his family, but he had never seen the whole world before. "I will give you one yam," Mr. Hare said. Okay, there's the buzzard, and there's Mr. Hare. That's a funny looking rabbit, isn't it? Okay. So, Mr. Buzzard flapped his wings and flew Mr. Hare high into the sky. He flew higher than the trees and higher than the mountains, and Mr. Hare looked down and saw the whole world, and he was happy. But then Mr. Buzzard turned himself over and began to fly upside down. "Don't fly upside down, Buzzard Bird," Mr. Hare called out. "I will fall off." If you give me 10 yams," Mr. Buzzard said, "I will take you down safely." Mr. Hare only had 10 yams, but when he looked down and saw that the ground was so far away, he knew he was in big trouble. His heart was beating as fast as it could. "I will give you 10 yams," Mr. Hare said. There he's riding the back of that buzzard. Wow, he's scared. When Mr. Buzzard heard this, he smiled a big buzzard smile. Then he turned himself right side up and flew to the ground. He took Mr. Hare's last 10 yams and carried them to his home. When Mr. Monkey saw this, he was very mad. His eyes grew shiny, and he gritted his teeth. "That was a bad thing to do to Mr. Hare," Mr. Monkey called out. But Mr. Buzzard did not care. He sat by a wide baobab tree, ate Mr. Hare's yams, and grinned at the sun. A month went by, and Mr. Buzzard was still not working. Mr. Hare was as skinny as a stick and walked around with a big tear in his eye. Mr. Monkey saw Mr. Buzzard talking to Mr. Antelope. "Give me one cassava root," Mr. Buzzard said, "and I will fly you up to the clouds. You will be the first antelope to see the whole world." Mr. Antelope looked at his wife. She did not look too hungry, so he gave a cassava root to Mr. Buzzard. Mr. Buzzard flew Mr. Antelope high into the clouds. Mr. Antelope looked down and saw the whole world. "Oh, the world is such a beautiful place," Mr. Antelope said. But then Mr. Buzzard turned over and flew upside down. "Do not fly upside down, Mr. Buzzard." Mr. Antelope's eyes rolled around. "I will fall off." "If you give me 10 cassava roots," Mr. Buzzard said, "I will fly you down safely." Now Mr. Antelope only had 10 roots, but he looked down and he knew he was in a lot of trouble. I will give you the roots, Mr. Antelope said. Take me down. Mr. Buzzard smiled as he straightened up, and he smiled as he flew Mr. Antelope down to the ground. He smiled even more as he took Mr. Antelope's last 10 roots. Mr. Monkey saw this and did not like what he saw. He turned around 3 times and stamped his foot. He stamped his foot on the ground. "Why did you do that bad thing?" Mr. Monkey called to Mr. Buzzard. But Mr. Buzzard did not listen. He just sat by the baobab tree, ate the roots, and grinned at the sun. Another month went by, and Mr. Buzzard was still not working. Mr. Antelope got skinny as a bone, and his wife ran away with the goat. Then Mr. Monkey saw Mr. Buzzard talking with Mr. Crab. "If you give me 1 fish," Mr. Buzzard said, "I will take you all the way up in the clouds. You will be the first crab to see the whole world." Mr. Crab knew he only had 1 fish to feed himself and his family, but he wanted to be the first crab to see the whole world. He gave Mr. Buzzard the fish. Mr. Buzzard flew Mr. Crab high into the clouds. Mr. Crab looked down and saw the whole world. He liked seeing the whole world and smiled a smile that went all the way around his head. But then Mr. Buzzard turned upside down as he had before. "Do not fly upside down, Mr. Buzzard," Mr. Crab called out. "I am afraid." "If you give me 10 fish," Mr. Buzzard said, "I will fly you down safely." Mr. Crab covered his eyes and promised he'd catch 10 fish to give Mr. Buzzard. 2 more months went by, and Mr. Buzzard was still not working. Mr. Buzzard looked up and saw Mr. Monkey sitting in a tree. "Hey, Mr. Monkey," Mr. Buzzard called out. "What do you want, Mr. Buzzard?" Mr. Monkey said. "If you give me 1 banana, I will fly you up to the clouds. You will be the first monkey to see the whole world." Mr. Monkey thought quickly. He knew Mr. Buzzard had a rock where his heart should be. Then he squeezed his face into a smile. "I will give you 1 banana," Mr. Monkey said, "but first I have to get a palm leaf to keep the sun from my head." Mr. Monkey got the palm leaf, jumped onto Mr. Buzzard's back, and held on as they flew to the clouds. Mr. Monkey saw the whole world for the first time and smiled his best monkey smile and stuck out his tongue. Then Mr. Buzzard turned upside down. Mr. Monkey was very scared. He held his breath, and he wrapped his tail around Mr. Buzzard's neck. Then he put the palm leaf over Mr. Buzzard's eyes. "Turn loose my neck, Mr. Monkey," Mr. Buzzard cried out. "Take the leaf from my eyes." Look at what he did. See how the monkey is covering his eyes and holding on for dear life? What happened next? "No," Mr. Monkey said. "If you turn over and fly right and give back the food you have taken from Mr. Hare, Mr. Antelope, and Mr. Crab, then I will let you down safely." Mr. Buzzard was so mad. He flew this way and that way and that way and this way, but still Mr. Monkey held on. He twirled and whirled and flipped and dipped, but it was no use. Mr. Monkey had him. Mr. Buzzard promised to give back all the food he had taken. Then Mr. Monkey took away the palm leaf from Mr. Buzzard's eyes, but he kept his tail wrapped around. Where did he keep it? Oh, lost my place. Wrapped around Mr. Buzzard's neck until they were down safely. Mr. Buzzard gave him the food and then flew away with an ugly look on his face. Mr. Monkey called his friends, Mr. Hare, Mr. Antelope, and Mr. Crab, and they all had a grand party and talked about how they had seen the whole world. Mr. Monkey ate as much as he could, then laughed the loudest monkey laugh that anybody on that island had ever heard. I hope you liked this story. See you next time.